The message moved quietly through a lawyer visit, passed into a phone call, then landed on a street corner where nobody asked extra questions. Somebody approved a move, money shifted hands, and a punishment lined up, even though the voice behind it sat sealed inside a concrete cell. That voice never raised volume, never rushed instructions, since this kind of exchange had already happened too many times to count. What made it unsettling was how normal it felt to everyone involved, like routine paperwork instead of something that could end a life. To understand how that became possible, the story has to rewind years earlier, before the cell, before the system, before the name meant anything. Francisco Martinez was born in Los Angeles in 1960 to immigrant parents who were working long hours while the neighborhood raised their kids. His childhood sat inside crowded blocks where street presence mattered more than future plans, and daily movement taught lessons school never touched. Older kids controlled corners, disputes got settled outside, and survival depended on who knew you, not what you hoped to become later. Nothing about his early life pointed toward legend, only familiarity with tension, loyalty, and the pressure to pick a side early. During his teenage years in the mid-'80s, Martinez drifted closer to crews tied to the 18th Street gang, mostly through proximity rather than ambition. Friends introduced friends, errands turned into favors, and favors gradually demanded proof, creating momentum that was hard to slow down. Police reports later described his early arrests as minor, but jail time still mattered since it exposed him to older players watching closely. That exposure planted ideas about hierarchy and discipline that the street rarely taught with any consistency. The nickname Puppet surfaced around this period, though its origin never landed on one clear explanation that everyone agreed on. Some said it came from a birthmark on his head, earning him the name Gorby inside lockups, which later morphed into something shorter. Others believed it described how he learned to move people quietly, pulling strings without stepping into the spotlight himself. What mattered more was that the name stuck, and sticking names usually meant somebody had been noticed. Prison changed the pace of Martinez's rise quicker than any block ever could, since structure inside rewarded patience and memory. Behind bars, affiliation meant everything, and aligning with La Emi demanded violence, silence, and absolute reliability under pressure. According to later testimony from Renee Boxer Enriquez, Martinez earned credibility through participation in prison stabbings during the mid-'80s. Those acts did not bring fame, but they placed him in conversations where decisions carried weight. By the time Martinez returned to the street, he no longer thought like a runner or shooter, but like someone mapping movement. He paid attention to cash routes, personalities, and who could be trusted to repeat orders without needing supervision. That shift marked the end of his role as a foot soldier, replacing action with coordination as his real leverage. His next incarceration locked that transition in place, turning confinement into a workspace instead of a limitation. The Columbia Little Psychos clique emerged inside that environment as an operational arm of the 18th Street gang. CLCS was not just a crew claiming territory, since it functioned like a service enforcing order through threat. Vendors received assigned spaces, dealers followed schedules, and everyone paid rent to avoid problems they could not afford. According to court filings, payments ranged from daily collections to weekly quotas, depending on location and product. Enforcement followed a pattern that removed negotiation from the equation completely. Collectors returned on schedule, warnings came once, and consequences arrived fast enough to discourage testing boundaries again. Assaults, disappearances, and selective killings reinforced compliance without requiring constant violence. Fear replaced discussion, turning sidewalks into managed assets rather than public space. From inside prison, Martinez understood that visibility attracted risk, while steady cash stayed quiet longer. Money mattered more than headlines, so discipline focused on consistency rather than chaos. Witnesses later described how CLCS generated tens of thousands of dollars weekly through vendor taxes, drug shifts, and underground businesses. That flow financed protection, loyalty, and silence across the neighborhood. By prioritizing revenue stability over street theatrics, CLCS became a machine instead of a mob. Every role stayed replaceable, orders traveled downward cleanly, and resistance rarely survived second chances. Violence remained present, but it served structure rather than impulse. That balance allowed control to expand quietly, setting the stage for influence that no longer required physical presence. Rent collection around MacArthur Park never felt random, since it followed routines that stayed consistent enough for everybody to memorize without writing anything down. Collectors walked the same paths on the same days, checking the same carts, storefronts, and corners while carrying notebooks only in their heads. Vendors learned quickly which faces meant payment time, which questions were acceptable, and which delays could quietly turn dangerous. The system worked smoothly since it removed guessing, replacing uncertainty with expectation, which kept fear controlled instead of chaotic. Street vendors were paid daily or weekly, depending on location, product, and traffic, while drug sellers worked under shift schedules designed to keep money flowing nonstop. According to federal filings later introduced in court, some collectors gathered hundreds per day, stacking thousands by week's end without drawing attention. Payments moved upward through trusted hands, never lingering too long in one place, which reduced exposure during police sweeps. Everyone understood that missing payments meant consequences that arrived fast enough to discourage creativity. Resistance did not usually start loudly, since most people tested limits quietly before refusing outright. Some vendors stalled with excuses about slow sales, family emergencies, or police pressure, hoping sympathy might soften expectations. That sympathy never arrived, since collectors documented excuses mentally and returned with a firmer posture next time. When delays continued, threats came calmly, framed as reminders rather than warnings, which made them harder to argue against. Punishment escalated in steps designed to teach lessons efficiently without wasting effort. First came flipped carts, broken windows, or stolen merchandise, which cost money without drawing police attention immediately. If defiance continued, beatings followed, delivered quickly and publicly enough to be noticed, but not lingered over. Murders remained rare at this stage, reserved for moments when authority needed reinforcement beyond doubt. Word traveled fast through MacArthur Park since survival depended on shared information more than secrecy. Vendors talked while packing up, dealers whispered during slow hours, and neighbors passed details across buildings without needing confirmation. Once punishment happened, stories spread, exaggerated or not, amplifying consequences beyond the original act. That amplification mattered, since reputation often worked harder than actual violence ever could. Early enforcement killings tied to rent disputes entered neighborhood memory through police reports and court testimony later. Prosecutors described instances where non-compliant individuals disappeared after repeated refusals, leaving behind empty stalls and unpaid debts. Bodies surfaced occasionally, sometimes miles away, sometimes not at all, but details remained vague enough to invite speculation. That uncertainty strengthened control since nobody needed full clarity to feel afraid. Street talk filled gaps left by official records, creating narratives that carried warnings louder than facts alone. Some stories exaggerated Martinez's reach, claiming instant retaliation for missed payments, even when timelines suggested delays. Other rumors inflated punishments, describing brutal outcomes that exceeded verified accounts. Those embellishments still served a purpose, reinforcing compliance without requiring constant enforcement. What mattered most was that violence never felt impulsive, since it followed rules understood by everyone involved. Collectors did not make freelance decisions, instead reporting issues upward before action occurred. That hierarchy reduced mistakes, protected foot soldiers, and ensured accountability stayed centralized. Control tightened as unpredictability disappeared from daily operations. Martinez's physical absence from the street actually sharpened this structure rather than weakening it. Without his presence, decisions relied on systems instead of personality, making enforcement less emotional and more procedural. Orders traveled downward cleanly, insulated from street noise, allowing discipline to stay consistent across time. That consistency built fear deeper than spectacle ever could. By the mid-1990s, rent collection had become normalized to the point where newcomers learned rules immediately. Vendors entering the park received instructions from neighbors before collectors even arrived. Compliance became cultural, reinforced through shared caution rather than constant threat. The machine ran quietly, powered by routine, memory, and reputation. While Martinez stayed locked inside facilities that grew more secure with each sentence, Janie Garcia became the face that translated orders into movement. Her presence connected prison instructions to sidewalk reality, ensuring nothing stalled during transfers or lockdowns. Law enforcement later described her as the operational bridge, not a symbolic partner, but a working authority. That role placed her at the center of daily decisions affecting money, discipline, and silence. Garcia did not move like a messenger repeating instructions word for word, since she exercised judgment shaped by experience. Collectors reported directly to her, bringing updates, problems, and cash without needing intermediaries. She resolved disputes quickly, deciding when leniency applied and when consequences followed immediately. That discretion made her feared, since outcomes depended on her assessment rather than fixed rules alone. Documented evidence from seizures and testimony showed Garcia handling tens of thousands monthly, sometimes more during peak periods. Police recovered cash hidden throughout residences, bundled and marked, confirming her control over revenue streams. Witnesses testified that payments passed through her before reaching accounts or investments tied to Martinez. Her involvement kept finances centralized while shielding the origin point from exposure. Her reputation around MacArthur Park traveled faster than her physical movement. Vendors recognized her vehicles, her associates, and her timing, adjusting behavior accordingly. Some described her presence as heavier than collectors, since her appearance signaled unresolved issues. That recognition reduced resistance before conversations even started. Court records documented moments where Garcia ordered punishments for perceived disrespect or mishandled payments. One case referenced her directing violence after receiving payments delivered improperly, interpreting the act as an intentional insult. Those responses reinforced expectations surrounding respect, reinforcing hierarchy through symbolic enforcement. Her decisions carried consequences without requiring Martinez's immediate input. Alongside documented actions, rumors expanded Garcia's image beyond verified conduct. Street stories claimed she consulted spiritual practices for protection, though no evidence supported those claims. Others suggested she manipulated multiple alliances through personal relationships, blending truth with speculation. Those narratives still strengthened her authority, adding mystique that discouraged challenges. Law enforcement distinguished carefully between provable acts and circulating talk, noting both influenced behavior, regardless of accuracy. Rumors created psychological barriers that evidence alone could not provide. Fear rooted in uncertainty proved harder to dismantle than fear based on known outcomes. Garcia benefited from that ambiguity without needing to encourage it openly. Her position insulated Martinez effectively, filtering information before it reached him. Problems arrived summarized, options outlined, and outcomes proposed, allowing him to approve direction without street exposure. That insulation reduced emotional responses while maintaining situational awareness. Martinez remained informed without becoming visible. Garcia's role also protected the broader operation from disruption during Martinez's transfers between facilities. When communication slowed, she maintained routines without improvising structural changes. That stability preserved cash flow and discipline during periods when leadership transitions often weaken organizations. Her consistency prevented cracks from forming. By concentrating authority through Garcia, the operation avoided fragmentation common in leaderless structures. Collectors answered upwards, disputes resolved downward, and money moved laterally into secure channels. Information stayed compartmentalized, limiting damage from arrests or cooperation. That architecture sustained influence despite growing scrutiny. In the end, Garcia's presence allowed Martinez to remain a decision-maker rather than a participant. He stayed removed from noise while remaining aware of movement, outcomes, and risks. Her position ensured his reach extended beyond concrete walls without exposing him directly. That arrangement kept the engine running long after most operations would have collapsed. The next layer of control did not come from muscle or fear, but from paperwork, access, and a quiet understanding of how legal space could be bent without snapping immediately. Isaac Gillan entered the picture not as a sudden accomplice, but as a slow-build solution to problems created by confinement. Attorney-client privilege offered privacy that phone calls inside facilities never guaranteed, and visits carried fewer eyes than street meetings ever could. Trust formed over time, built through routine legal work, conversations framed as defense strategy, and favors that looked harmless until patterns formed. Money followed similar pathways, never moving all at once or through obvious channels. Cash collected on the street moved through trusted hands before reaching accounts connected to shell businesses, relatives, or legal retainers. Federal filings later described how funds flowed through bank accounts, investments, and front companies, creating distance between origin and destination. That distance mattered, since laundering depended on time, repetition, and patience rather than speed. Gillan's role expanded alongside trust as he began handling financial arrangements tied to Martinez's interests. Payments arrived labeled as legal fees, loans, or business transactions, blending into legitimate activity. Prosecutors later showed how more than $1 million moved through accounts linked to Gillan, much of it traced back to extortion and drug proceeds. Each transfer alone appeared explainable, but combined, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore forever. Messages moved alongside money, often embedded inside legal updates or personal discussions. References to individuals used nicknames, metaphors, or coded terms that required shared context to interpret correctly. Witnesses later testified that words like fumigate signaled approval for killing, while other phrases indicated discipline or relocation. Those codes allowed authorization without direct instruction, preserving plausible distance between speaker and outcome. This system survived multiple incarcerations and transfers since it relied on roles rather than physical proximity. When Martinez moved between facilities, Gillan remained constant, carrying continuity across transitions. Legal visits continued regardless of housing status, preserving communication lines even inside higher security settings. That consistency allowed operations to remain stable despite increasing restrictions. Trust extended beyond communication into protection, since Gillan's presence discouraged internal dissent. Associates believed that messages delivered through an attorney carried legitimacy and consequence. That belief reinforced compliance without constant enforcement, since disobedience risked unseen repercussions. Authority traveled quietly, reinforced by the assumption that nothing stayed truly hidden. Over time, the scale of activity increased beyond what discretion alone could conceal. Larger sums required more complex laundering, which increased exposure. Additional participants expanded risk as silence depended on loyalty across many hands. Investigators began noticing patterns that did not match ordinary legal practice, drawing attention slowly but steadily. Law enforcement eventually recognized that legal privilege had become infrastructure rather than protection. Wiretaps, informants, and financial analysis converged, revealing how access had been exploited over the years. What once looked like isolated anomalies began aligning into a coherent picture. Silence still held, but pressure was building where it could no longer be ignored. The operation changed course on September 15, 2007, when a routine enforcement action produced consequences nobody inside the structure could contain. A street vendor near MacArthur Park refused to pay a $50 tax, triggering instructions that followed established patterns. Giovanni Macedo, an 18-year-old aspiring member, carried out the order with a firearm, aiming at the vendor as directed. One bullet struck a 23-day-old infant named Luis Angel Garcia, killing him in his stroller. That death violated internal rules that had guided enforcement for years, rules understood even by those comfortable with violence. Children were considered off-limits, since their deaths drew attention that money and silence could not soften. Panic spread quickly through the organization, not from remorse, but from fear of exposure. The act threatened everything built through patience and discipline. Immediate response focused on containment rather than accountability. Leadership determined that the shooter had to be silenced to prevent cooperation and redirect blame. Orders moved through familiar channels, framing the situation as damage control rather than punishment. Macedo was lured under false pretenses, believing protection awaited him elsewhere. A serious incident involving Macedo unfolded clumsily, revealing cracks previously hidden by efficiency. He was kidnapped, beaten, and taken to Mexico, where execution attempts failed despite multiple efforts. Macedo survived strangulation attempts and a planned disposal over a cliff, escaping against expectation. His survival transformed him from a liability into a threat. Public outrage erupted as news of the infant's death spread beyond the neighborhood. Media coverage intensified, politicians responded, and law enforcement shifted posture rapidly. Surveillance escalated into aggressive investigation, prioritizing dismantling over monitoring. The case became a symbol, drawing resources that quiet extortion never attracted. Macedo's cooperation followed survival, driven by fear and self-preservation rather than ideology. He provided details about rent collection, coded language, and the chain of command linking street actions to prison authority. His testimony confirmed patterns investigators had suspected, but could not previously prove. That confirmation changed everything. Federal authorities unsealed indictments targeting dozens of individuals tied to the Columbia Little Psychos clique. Charges included racketeering, murder, kidnapping, extortion, and money laundering. Evidence combined wiretaps, financial records, and witness testimony into a narrative that reached beyond individual acts. The case expanded quickly, pulling legal, financial, and violent threads together. Inside the organization, trust eroded as arrests mounted. Members questioned communication channels, loyalty, and the reliability of long-standing protections. Some attempted distancing, others considered cooperation, and discipline tightened unevenly. Fear shifted direction, turning inward instead of outward. The baby's death marked the first visible fracture in an operation built on control. What had once functioned quietly now attracted scrutiny impossible to deflect. Enforcement routines that relied on silence faced exposure under public pressure. The system remained intact, but cracks had formed where confidence once lived. Federal attention did not arrive all at once since investigators moved in layers, starting quietly and widening only after patterns refused to disappear. Task forces compared notes across agencies, lining up vendor complaints, financial anomalies, and intercepted conversations that shared timing without sharing language. What looked like isolated incidents began aligning into sequences, which mattered more than any single piece of evidence. That alignment shifted posture from watching behavior to mapping systems. Wiretaps became useful only after analysts learned how to listen differently, since ordinary transcripts revealed nothing obvious at first glance. Phrases repeated across calls began to stand out, especially metaphors that never appeared outside specific disputes. Investigators compared dates, locations, and outcomes, discovering that coded words preceded movement with consistent results. Once decoded, the language stopped sounding abstract and started functioning like approval stamps. Financial tracing followed similar logic, focusing less on amounts than on rhythm, timing, and repetition across accounts. Payments labeled as legal fees, consulting costs, or loans moved in predictable cycles that mirrored street collections. Analysts tracked flows through shell businesses, relatives, and retainers, watching distance grow between source and destination. That distance suggested intent rather than coincidence, tightening the narrative around laundering. Witnesses began turning once the scope became clear, often prompted by fear rather than loyalty to law enforcement. Some insiders recognized that silence protected systems, not individuals, especially when indictments widened beyond street roles. Cooperation offered clarity, protection, or time depending on leverage. Timing mattered, since early cooperation shaped narratives while late cooperation confirmed them. Former insiders provided translation more than confession, explaining hierarchy, expectations, and consequences without dramatizing involvement. They clarified how instructions traveled, why delays signaled danger, and which channels carried legitimacy. Their accounts matched wiretap outcomes closely enough to validate interpretations. That validation transformed suspicion into structured cases. Martinez remained involved throughout this phase, though his participation became procedural rather than directive. Messages continued traveling through trusted channels, approvals remained measured, and finances stayed compartmentalized. Indictments stacking up did not halt movement immediately, since systems already existed to absorb pressure. That resilience delayed collapse, but also deepened exposure. The federal case unfolded in stages, each wave tightening constraints without ending operations outright. Arrests removed foot soldiers, then collectors, then facilitators, forcing adaptations that increased complexity. Complexity bred mistakes, which produced new evidence feeding subsequent stages. Pressure accumulated quietly, pushing the structure toward rigidity. Convictions eventually landed across multiple roles, reflecting enterprise rather than isolated acts. Sentences removed experience faster than replacements could compensate, slowing operations that relied on memory and trust. cash flow narrowed, communication shortened, and enforcement routines lost consistency. The system did not explode, but it stalled, struggling to maintain momentum under constant observation. ADX Florence introduced constraints that no previous facility imposed, not through spectacle, but through routine deprivation of interaction. Days followed identical schedules, contact was narrowed to controlled visits, and movement was reduced to essentials. Noise disappeared, replaced by isolation that discouraged coordination. The environment punished continuity more than disobedience. Communication narrowed sharply under these conditions, limiting frequency, duration, and content. Legal visits remained possible, though scrutiny intensified and delays increased. Messages shortened, codes simplified, and ambiguity replaced nuance. Authority persisted, but execution lagged behind intent. Remaining influence depended on legacy rather than presence, drawing power from habits formed earlier. Some orders still traveled outward, but responses slowed, filtered through layers now cautious of exposure. Attempts to adapt relied on redundancy, spreading responsibility across multiple channels. That redundancy increased risk instead of resilience. Internal opposition within llings surfaced quietly, fueled by frustration over declining returns and rising danger. Some questioned continued allegiance, others tested boundaries, and discipline faltered without immediate correction. Green lights once issued decisively now faced delay or dissent. Control softened at the previously rigid. Rumors of hidden money circulated widely, claiming stashes buried across borders or investments shielded indefinitely. Law enforcement acknowledged incomplete recovery while documenting significant seizures tied to relatives and fronts. The gap between rumor and record widened as time passed. Wealth no longer functioned as leverage without access. Martinez's reach diminished as isolation stretched across years, eroding situational awareness. Updates arrived filtered, decisions lagged behind reality, and adjustments missed timing windows. Authority shifted from active management to symbolic weight. Influence persisted unevenly, no longer absolute. Isolation achieved what enforcement alone could not, disrupting coordination beyond repair. Systems built on memory faltered without reinforcement, routines decayed, and fear lost clarity. The machine slowed, not through collapse, but through attrition. Concrete walls finished the work that investigations began. Vendors talk more openly now, comparing stories about inspectors, rival hustlers, and the cost of staying visible without protection. Some remember the old system with bitterness, others with a strange clarity, since predictability once felt safer than randomness. Copycat crews still try versions of rent collection, but without centralized authority, their efforts break faster. Quiet intimidation replaced organized enforcement, trading structure for improvisation that rarely lasts. Extortion did not vanish. It scattered, spreading into subtler demands tied to services, parking, or access instead of fixed payments. Threats arrive indirectly, pass through relatives, neighbors, or anonymous warnings rather than uniform collectors. These pressures feel smaller individually, yet harder to confront collectively. Absence of a single system created friction that no one fully controls. Looking back, Martinez's legacy makes more sense when viewed as architecture rather than personality. He built routines that outlived proximity, relying on repetition, memory, and trust instead of constant presence. His influence came from designing a structure where roles mattered more than faces. That design allowed continuity even when leadership disappeared from the street. Reducing the story to one villain misses how many people maintained the system willingly. Collectors, facilitators, messengers, and protectors all played roles shaped by opportunity and fear. Each decision fed momentum that no single arrest could stop immediately. Responsibility diffused across layers, complicating closure. Unanswered questions remain, lingering between rumor and record without resolution. Money disappeared into accounts never fully traced, relationships ended without testimony, and some deaths remain officially unsolved. Stories continue circulating about hidden cash, unfinished orders, and loyalties that never flipped. Those gaps keep speculation alive without changing outcomes. Law enforcement considers the case a success measured by disruption rather than erasure. The system no longer operates at scale, and coordination fractured beyond repair. That fragmentation achieved what convictions alone could not, preventing rebuild through exhaustion. Silence returned, but it feels different now.